Are you down with SOPs? Yeah, you know me. Are you down with SOPs? Yeah, you know me. Okay, yeah, that's what this section's going to be about. It's standard operating procedures, which is otherwise known as SOP. And you're probably thinking, well, my goodness, we just went video after video after video on what these things called methods are. Isn't that the same as SOP? No, it's not. It's not the same as SOP, folks. SOP is kind of like the child of an approved method from a company. So again, what we've said a few times already in these past videos is that standard operating procedures, also known as SOPs, are a way that a company can take something that has been approved formally, like a method, and adapt it and make very small changes in order for it to be customizable to their company. So this, again, focuses on something like equipment, right? So if I had a certain pH probe and that pH probe was in my lab, the method is probably going to tell me, oh, you need a calibrated pH probe. And I'm going to think, thank you, method. I know that I'm going to have to calibrate a pH probe. But they're not going to give me directions on how to calibrate the pH probe. They are going to rely on the SOP to tell the workers in the laboratory how the company calibrates their pH probe and the steps that they have to take in order to go through that process based on the instrument and the model number that they have. So that's just one example of many of why a method cannot be a one-size-fits-all. A method can only do so much, and a method can give you a procedure. Those procedure steps very often talk about collection, preservation, storage, and the quality control samples that go with it, and how to process the samples. But all of the little bitty details that happen within a laboratory that's really going to be unique to that particular laboratory, that is where SOP is going to come into play. So there's a few things that I want to talk about as far as the SOP goes. So first off, it's got to be a set of written instructions. And very often there's going to be paper copies, hard copies that are going to be located within a lab. And that's very important because not everyone is going to have access to a computer. And in addition to that, what if the internet goes down? What if the computer goes kerplunk? And we don't have a way to access those SOPs that are electronically. So if I don't have a backup to the electronic versions of the SOP, then my company is going to be in trouble. The lab workers are going to be in trouble. They might not remember every single step. And it's there almost like a recipe to make sure that you really do understand and remember all of the steps that are going to be required for the procedure and do them in that particular order. So there are a set of written instructions. Very often they are local. Which means that the SOPs that apply to that area are found in that area. And in a different lab or in a different room, whatever they're doing might require an SOP, and they will find only the SOPs that apply to them. So this is not going to be a master SOP copy that's going to be everywhere, filled with hundreds of SOPs for you to dig through, because there's a chance that we don't need all of those for the immediate area that I'm working in. SOPs will often come along with instrumentation as well. Not only just the calibration piece, but starting the machines up and shutting the machines down. How to use the software. What button do I push? And then after that, what's the next button that I push? The instrumentation pieces have a very large role in SOP, and that's because a lot of people feel uncomfortable with technology, and there's going to be some turnover. You're going to have new faces that are going to be using that equipment, and yes, you're going to get training on it, but the problem is that the training can only do so much. So your hands have to be on the mouse, your hands have to be on the keyboard, your hands have to be kind of clicking buttons in the software and those types of things. So instrumentation is going to have its own SOP if this is a legit lab that really wants to put quality behind their data and limit the number of problems that go on in a laboratory arena. Next up, the SOP has to ensure that a person performs the job properly, right? That's the whole idea with all of this. So if we're going to go through the motions of hiring you, if we're going to make sure that you're getting trained, if we're going to document that training that you're going to have, then we want to make sure that once you get in to the lab and do real things and generate real data, that you're going to do that continuously the proper way. So the SOP is going to help ensure that, because this should be a form that we should be using and that we should be following to make sure that we are doing the steps that we're supposed to be doing, like the company expects us to. Next up, there's a thing. I mean, I know that we've been talking about quality control, quality QC, quality control. I know that, but there's also another group here that's going to be called the quality assurance group. And the quality assurance group just simply assures that quality is being upheld. And the quality control group is the group that's making sure that quality is going into this. All right. So for instance, in the QC department, the QC is going to be in charge of doing those standards and reviewing those standards, making sure the standards are part of our sample processing. Once we do them, they get those reports, they generate some of that data, they cross-reference some of those thresholds to make sure that everything passes. So that's the purpose of the quality control group. But who is overseeing the quality control group to make sure that they're doing the job that they're supposed to be doing? And that is the QA department. So typically the QA is the overseer of everyone, and they are just reviewing the QC data, reviewing the things that they're doing to make sure it makes sense, to make sure they're documenting things the proper way, they're filing things the proper way, because at any point in time, an auditor can come into the company and the auditor can ask the QA department, let us see your quality control schemes. Let us see how you are processing these samples. Let's see how you are generating quality data. So the QA department is the group that's responsible for that. So imagine them as somewhat of the managers of the QC department. Now, depending on the type of company that you work for, QA and QC could be built together. So the QA and the QC department oversees each other. There could be a member of management that kind of manages everything, and then a couple of people that work the QC area to make sure the data is checking out. In other companies, these are two separate departments depending on their size, the types of tests that they do, how many tests that they do, and so forth. So there could be two totally different buildings. The QC department could be doing its thing in its own area, and they are dumping all of that information into the QA department. So that could have its own office suite, it could have its own building, whatever the case is. But these two groups have to work very closely together. They should not be, for instance, one established in New York City and the other one out in San Francisco, California. They should work very closely together. They should have constant contact with each other, because it is their job to really oversee the QC, and QC is that job is to oversee the lab data that comes through their doors and hopefully gets that final stamp of approval. So, if any step of the SOP, folks, is not followed, the SOP is invalidated at that moment. So, the SOP fails. That's what we call that. So, you failed the SOP. You did not follow those steps in that direction. And what happens here is that the samples that you have processed now, they're not going to be very good. So you're not going to be able to release any of the data, which required time. It required reagents. It required sample prep. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into processing samples on a daily basis. So if you do not follow the SOPs verbatim as they're written, and I'm going to say that again, verbatim as they're written, then you are invalidating the SOP. And if you invalidate the SOP, you invalidate the samples that took place while you were processing them. So I hope that you're not going to be that person that's going to have to go in and run the batch of samples and new quality control samples all over again just because you did not follow the steps as they were written in the SOP. Now, who's responsible for this? That's going to be the member of management, right? So there's going to be very often a person in the laboratory that's going to be in charge, and that management person's role is to make sure that the laboratory workers are following the SOP. And sometimes that role is going to require them to quiz That's right, quiz the lab workers. So a member of management is going to come up and be like, hey, why did you do this step? What's the purpose in that? Or, hey, without looking at the SOP, could you kind of walk me through the steps that you are taking in order to process a sample? They are just pushing you to the moment of making sure that you realize what the steps of the SOP are for, what's the purpose in those steps, why are they important, and they're kind of figuring out what you remember. What's your training like? How knowledgeable are you in this method? And the reason that they're doing this is because the members of management, if they are pushing you and interrogating you, and I hate to use that word because they're not really interrogating you, but they just want to make sure that you fully understand what's going on in a lab. If they are quizzing you, the reason for this is because auditors can do this as well. In other words, what can happen, and this is a requirement, companies do get audited, and the auditors are going to come into the business and they're going to sit down at a table and they can pull the laboratory workers out of the room and they can sit them down one-on-one and they begin to have a discussion with them. Like, what kind of things do you do here in the company? What kind of SOPs are you trained on? So what kind of jobs are you doing? What kind of lab tests are you doing? Okay, well, let's pull out this SOP. Why are you adding hydrochloric acid here in this step? Did anyone ever tell you that? Or when you generate a calibration curve, what's the purpose of the cal standards that you are making here? Do you remember what those standard concentrations should be? How is the machine kind of generating a signal? Auditors do that, and these laboratory managers have to make sure that you are properly trained and knowledgeable in the SOPs that they're getting you to do for this specific reason. Because if the auditors come in and they begin to interrogate and they begin to question and they begin to realize that the laboratory workers have no clue what's going on, then they're going to be like, the company doesn't have a clue what's going on. So someone's going to have to take the fall for it. And if it's not the lab worker, it's going to be the lab managers for sure. So direct supervisors are very important. They are there to watch everyone do the testing. They're there to provide some of that training and provide some of that teaching responsibility in a way to make sure their lab workers are very well knowledged in the SOPs that they are performing. For this reason, you're going to see that these direct supervisors are really placed in areas with the laboratory workers, or at least they should be. So I want you to imagine a big room like we have on campus, and everyone's doing the lab testing. Somewhere in that lab, they would have a dedicated space to a lab manager. That lab manager might have their own room. That lab manager might have a door that they can shut and that they can just be in, peace and quiet throughout the day. But that lab manager needs to be nearby these laboratory workers so that way they can answer questions, they can watch what goes on, they can stop into the laboratory and just kind of watch people do their job and make sure they're doing it the proper way. That is their role, and they should not be located way down the hallway in a weird corner room that is not really easy accessible or that's not very convenient for the laboratory workers when they need them. So for that reason, very often you'll see office spaces within real working laboratories, and that is why those people are nearby. Next up, electronic copies of the SOPs are okay. That is not an issue at all. These are legal, they are valid, but you've got to have a backup at least, because if those electronic copies are not accessible at that moment in time, and there's always going to be those moments in time that something's going to whack out or the power's going to go out or something, but you've got to have a backup plan. So electronic SOPs work wonderfully, right? So imagine you going up in a laboratory and you get on a computer that is going to be dedicated to you. You log in, you get your username and password, and then the computer is going to give you the approved SOPs that you are trained on that you can access. So you can click on those almost like a document or a file. You can open those up. You can review them. You can see what's there. Not a big issue at all. Actually, it's encouraged in order to save on some of the paperwork and the printing that goes on within a laboratory space. But if that computer goes down, or for some reason the internet doesn't work, or the networking doesn't work, and you do not have access to these electronic SOPs, we have a problem. And that problem can easily be fixed if you have a master folder that's going to house all of the SOPs that lab area might be responsible for. So again, you might not find all SOPs in that one folder in the entire company, but you should be able to find all of the relevant SOPs in that master folder in your area that you work in. So for instance, if I'm working in the lab and my job is a lab worker, the custodial staff probably has an SOP that they have to follow. Well, they're not going to give you the custodial staff SOP in the master folder that they have within the laboratory area. Doesn't make any sense. Why would you have that? The custodial staff probably has their own master copy in one of their meeting rooms or one of their storage rooms or whatever the case might be, but that is somewhere within the company. It's not relevant to you. Why should you see it? Why should you need it? It's just wasting time if you have to flip through those papers and those documents. So that's kind of the intro to an SOP. So again, a more detailed version of a method. It's giving you the same information that a method might. A method is the place that the SOP gets created from, and then we just fine-tune it and detail it from that moment on. So the benefits of the SOP are going to be, a couple of things here that are music to companies' ears, really. And there's a couple of different benefits that we can talk about that I think that would make sense to you. So first off, it minimizes what we call variation. This is good because we don't want different people that are doing the same job to do it different ways. So we want to limit the variation that goes on in the daily task and the daily steps that people have to follow. And if they follow a set of directions, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, then hopefully we can limit the varied steps and get more consistent data as a result of that. Next up, it ensures consistency with the workforce and personnel changes. So this is another thing that's going to happen. I don't care where you work. There's going to be changeover. There's going to be people that are going to come in and work for a few months. There's going to be people that will come in and work for many years. It's just nothing. It's a revolving door. There's nothing that you can do about it. I don't care how good the company is. You're going to have people that start a job and you're going to have people that quit a job. So all of these people are going to need training. We know that. All of these people are going to be familiar with SOPs, absolutely. But again, the issue here is no matter if you've been working at the company for 10 years or whether you've been working for the company at 1 month, this SOP will provide you the steps and will provide you the information in order to do your job the proper way. And that's what this is all about. So the proper way, again, experience 10 plus years or maybe 1 month, doesn't really matter. The SOPs are there for those groups if they need. And maybe you've been there for 10 years, right? Maybe this is something that, yes, you've been there, you've done it. I know what kind of goes on. Absolutely. But maybe, just maybe, you need a little bit of reminders or refreshers because you've not done that method in quite some time. And again, the purpose of the SOP is fulfill that void that might happen in a laboratory setting. Next up, SOPs do address safety. This is something that an SOP doesn't really stress. A lot of times when people are trained on SOPs, they don't really take a look at this. If you are working with hazardous chemicals, how do we get rid of them? How do we work with them safely? That should be part of the SOP. It will be there. But a lot of people focus on the procedure and that is it. And by all means, the procedure is a very important part of the puzzle. But safety issues and concerns are also a thing as well. Do I dump everything down the drain? Right? That's always the question that we get. And the SOP should and will tell you how to handle that waste and how to handle the things that are coming from these SOPs as we complete and do these tests. SOPs can also be used what we do call reconstructive projects. So for instance, years later down the road, you might find yourself in a situation where an auditor has came in and took a look at some data that happened from 2 years ago. And they're like, listen, we need to kind of figure out, what happened during that time that caused this data? What steps did you take? Could you tell us about the processes? Could you tell us about this? Could you tell us about these sample types or these observations that were going on at the time? And without an SOP, you might forget what happened 2 years ago. I mean, can you you remember that chicken recipe that you did 2 years ago that your best friend really loved and you've not made it since? Absolutely not. So this is going to be a way that we can go back and reference to a lab procedure and be like, listen, this is what was done at this time. This was the steps that we followed. This is what was provided to us, right? Because SOPs can be revised and SOPs can change. And depending on what goes on, the laboratory data might change as well. Maybe just slightly, but it could change. Your steps could be mixed up and so forth. So this is something that helps us keep track of everything. And that's why we say reconstruct the project. So that way, if I did data from 2 years ago, I can go back and pull the SOP that was followed from 2 years ago and follow that SOP as it was written, as it was provided to the lab workers. And I should be able to replicate that data that I was getting at that particular moment in time. And then finally, they are used by auditors, right? This is a word that keeps popping up. I know, auditor, auditor, auditor. It is a thing. I mean, these companies are regulated. There's got to be some oversight. There has to be some way that, these companies can be double checked to make sure they're providing quality data. And this is one of those. So the auditors are also going to look at the SOPs and they will use it as a checklist. So what will happen is that they'll go through and they'll review the steps of the procedure and they'll be like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Yeah, this reads very clearly. Okay, yeah, I don't have a problem. Well, wait a minute. The verbiage of this sentence is a little weird. So I would like to investigate that procedure step and I would like to see some data or some people's notes that are coming from that procedure step just to make sure that they really fully understand what you meant, because the auditor might not know what you mean, but maybe the workers did, and maybe there's not an issue, but it is still a checklist that these auditors can go by when they review the data and when they look at these reports that get submitted to them and to the QC department eventually in the QA. All right. The format of the SOP, very similar, folks, to what you've seen before. There really isn't a major difference from the method. So you're going to see all of the major components of the method show up in an SOP. The format should be very concise. The format should be step by step. The format should be easy to read. It should not be complicated. It should be simple. It should be short. And flowcharts are heavily encouraged. So what this means is that the method is going to provide severe detail for the company. And that's really what the method is going to be used for. So that company is going to bring down the method that's approved, and the company is going to make decisions on what parts of those methods are going to be most relevant to their lab workers. And they get rid of the fat. They get rid of the pieces that the lab worker does not need. And they really distill the method down to just really, I'm going to say lab procedure, but there's going to be more than just a procedure step. But just the lab procedure at the heart. So they have made sure that quality is built in. They've made sure that all of the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. And they have reworded and reformatted the method just so slightly so that we can give it to laboratory workers and just streamline the sentences, get rid of all of the chunky information that doesn't need to be there. Lab workers might not care what certain things mean, or they might not care how certain things are made. So we get rid of that in the SOP, and we really just make the life of the laboratory worker a little bit easier if we keep that in mind. So that's why you are seeing concise steps. Make sure it's step by step. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Get rid of the lingo that laboratory workers might have a problem with. So keep the verbiage very simple. Keep the sentence structure very clean. We're not asking for term papers here. It doesn't need to be that. So again, get rid of the fat, get rid of the things that aren't relevant, and just really provide the most important pieces that are out there. Not complicated, that goes hand in hand, right? Simple, short, and flowcharts are always a plus. These flowcharts are for very visual learners, of course. That is something that we like to see. It's certain things that some laboratory workers respond much better to than written sentences, and visual is always going to be a plus. So flowcharts, and I'm going to put diagrams in this category because that's always going to be encouraged in a SOP, which makes it a little bulkier sometimes, makes it have some more pages at sometimes, but it could serve a role, and you might as well provide it. I mean, if you're going to take the trouble of writing an SOP, give them the information that's going to help them do their job. And if a flow chart or some type of visual diagram will allow that person to understand things much better, then provide it to them. I mean, that is your role as a company. That's your role as a laboratory manager. That's what should be doing in a laboratory space. So in the next video, we'll continue this discussion of SOP. We'll just generally overview it. We'll talk a little bit about law and regulation here in the next video. So stay tuned, come back. Don't blaze through this material. Again, there's going to be nuggets of information that you might learn that you might be not aware of, but now you will be after you watch these videos. So come back to me. Crack knuckles, get your pen ready, sharpen those pencils, get a new sheet of paper. You're going to need it.